Hi everyone. I am curling up in my chair getting comfy because I'm going to do something a little bit different today, and I'm going to tell you some stories about me and my life and my interaction with TCKs before I was ever a TCK or ever worked with TCKs. One thing that was really fascinating for me when I was doing some research and preparing to write the book was looking back on my own path, my own story, and recognizing that a lot of my best friends growing up were TCKs. I grew up, in Sydney until I was 8, where there were a lot of kids in my school and in my acquaintance who were cross-cultural. About half of Australians have at least one parent born outside Australia, and so a cross-cultural childhood, I think, is almost more common than a monocultural childhood in a lot of ways. I certainly had a lot of friends growing up who were first, second generation immigrant families, some who had multi-ethnic or multicultural heritage. I remember being about 7 and getting in this weird grumpiness about how my family was boring because I felt like all of my friends had some other cultural heritage to draw upon that they had a close connection to. Whereas for me, the closest connection I could draw was Dutch, but my Dutch great-grandfather had really distanced himself from that culture, and so we really had no cultural linguistic connection to it. And everything else was fairly distant. So I remember feeling my experience as the abnormal one, which I'm not sure that it was, but I think it shows a lot about the people I was spending my time with. My best friend as a little kid was the boy down the road who was a few years older than me. And, his parents were from different cultures and different ethnic backgrounds. So he was mixed in various ways. My next best friend, her parents are from different cultures. It was just the norm that I grew up around. To the point that my mum had trouble working out how to describe my friends because those experiences of being of different cultural, linguistic, racial backgrounds to me were so normal that I didn't think to use them as identifiers. And I remember her one time trying to work out who this person was I'd invited to my birthday party. I'm like, does this name go with this face I have in my mind? And it was my friend who was Sri Lankan, and she was trying to work out how to ask that without sounding racist because it just never occurred to me to describe her by her colour. And it was something I almost had to unlearn as an adult because I think being colourblind is not helpful because it erases an experience that somebody has. But I think what it shows is that my growing up, having a mixture of experiences around me felt normal. Then we moved to Sydney. Moved from Sydney to Canberra. Canberra had a less ethnically diverse background in some ways, but still very culturally diverse. There was a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe, so still fairly Caucasian, but in my classroom there in grade 4, 5, 6, I'd have people from Croatia and Serbia during the time of the Balkan War, and that would come up in class because they were hearing from their parents. People from Hungary and I don't know, just all over the place, Ukraine, and as well as Asian countries. And it was just normal, I think. But this is where I first interacted with a TCK. Didn't realise for like 20 years that she was a TCK. But so my best friend, sort of grade 4, 5, 6, her name was Kerry. So Kerry's dad was from the UK, her mum was from New Zealand. She grew up in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and had moved to Australia maybe a year before we met. She moved into the town and I moved from Sydney, and we were at the same school together. I think she got there a few weeks before I did. I remember going to her house, and their house was full of things from these different cultural influences, these Turkish rugs, for example, and things like that. And I still have on my bookshelf next to my desk, I have these little wooden dolls that she gave me from Turkey, like just beautiful little 2-piece wooden painted little family of dolls. And at some point, I'd been in China about 6 years, and I decided I was really living in China, and I had a bunch of my stuff shipped from Australia, so like my whole life was here. And one of the things that came with these little dolls from her, and I looked at those dolls and it suddenly hit me. I think Carrie must have been a TCK. I'd always assumed she was Australian. I was so used to having friends with these different cultural influences, it just hadn't occurred to me until that moment in my late 20s working with TCKs, looking at these dolls, that she was a TCK and she probably had never been an Australian citizen. And I actually went and wrote to her. I mean, we were connected on Facebook. We hadn't really talked that much. But I sent her an email. I said, here's the work that I do. And I just realized, and can I ask the question, were you Australian? And we had this great sort of back and forth about it, and she got really interested in the work that I was doing, and she said, yeah, no, I wasn't. I was a UK citizen, not an Australian citizen. But she became an Australian citizen later and talked about the experience of travelling to the UK, which is her original passport country that she hadn't lived in, but now going with an Australian passport, and the cultural experience went with that. It was fascinating. But I reflected back and I realised all these things that I had done to her by not understanding where she was coming from. I remember not understanding what I now know were British pronunciations that she would use. Like she would say yogurt instead of yogurt and vitamin instead of vitamin. These British pronunciations that she'd been raised with that to me sounded weird because it hadn't occurred to me that she wasn't Australian and that she had learned a different way of speaking. But I loved that. I loved that she had, you know, stories and experiences of a different place. And it just, again, didn't strike me as weird. It was just part of what was Carrie. Like, Carrie grew up in Turkey. Okay, like, that just felt normal. Then she moved away, strangely enough, back to a very similar area to where I had lived in Sydney, and then she became friends with some of my childhood friends, which was just the weirdest coincidence. And I went on to, you know, what we call high school, so starting in grade 7. And soon after, I became friends with 2 Malay diplomat kids. So their dads worked with the Malay Air Force, or was one Navy Air Force? But anyway, we're with the Malaysian embassy in Canberra. And somehow we became good friends, I guess, toward the end of grade 7. So they both spent time in a transition school that Canberra has for diplomat kids, where they get sort of more intensive English and getting used to Canberra and getting used to how school's done in Australia before they go into regular public schools. And so Anna had about 6 months there, and Shiana had, I think, a little bit longer. So they came in partway through the year. And for whatever reason, we just really clicked. And they would teach me some Malay eventually. I eventually convinced them to teach me some Malay, mostly because I wanted to join in. You know, I wanted to be able to talk to them the way they talk to each other. And I knew I couldn't really learn all of it, but we had all these different things that we would do. Like I would write a letter that was as much Malay as I knew, with English words where I didn't know the words or whatever. And then, you know, usually Anna would take it, and then she would write back to me, and she would give me the vocab I didn't know from the last letter and the vocab she thought would be new to me in this letter. And we would go back and forth like this, and that was part of the way I learned new vocab. And Malay is a language where the spelling system is phonetic. So if you can spell it, you can pronounce it, basically. So that was actually very helpful. I started by getting one of them to teach me a phrase that I could then say to the other one. Some of the first things I learned were like really kind of childish insults, because like, you know, if they wouldn't translate or something, I would learn to say "you're mean." And very quickly I learned to say "stop laughing," because that was usually the reaction to me trying to speak Malay. So I have all these really great memories of that. They're also my first Muslim friends, and they taught me a lot because they were really gracious to me as someone who really didn't know anything about their religion and culture, that they would answer questions and they would share things with me about their faith and their choices and their family and their religious culture that was really interesting, and I really, really appreciate. Because I don't think it's always easy to have to be the one who has to represent, like, you know, to look at me as a, you know, 13-year-old who didn't know anything about Islam and be the one person representing that whole faith to me. I mean, that could be a lot of pressure, and yet they were really gracious. And still, one of my greatest regrets is I was invited to, you know, Anna's family's Hari Raya celebration, and I couldn't go because I had something on that weekend. And I still have the invitation that she had given to me to come to this for the end of Ramadan. And yeah, like I look back so fondly on that. I'm still connected to both of them on Facebook, and I see their pictures of them with their kids, and both serving in their military. And yeah, like every now and then I'll comment on one of their like photos, on one of Anna's photos, and her mum will be like, "When do you come to visit?" Which is really awesome. Yeah, I had really wanted to go to her wedding, and it just didn't work out between events I had on. So yeah, I'm so thankful for that experience. Then I moved to to the US from Australia. It's twice I've done that. And, you know, one of my good friends there was another TCK. Her mum worked with my dad, like, well, in the same company. I don't think they actually worked in the same office. But, you know, we lived in the same town, and so there was this, and we went to the same church as well. There was this just connection of both being sort of fish out of water in some ways. They were from Northern Ireland. And I remember her older brother had maintained a fairly Northern Irish kind of accent. I'm sure it had been switched to become slightly American, just as my Australian accent had become slightly American. But my friend Alison did a really fantastic code switching. It was the first time I'd seen that in operation. I mean, something I've seen over and over again as an adult working with TCKs, but Alison was the first person I'd seen do this, where she used, her accent changed depending on who she was addressing. So she was speaking to an American, she used an American accent. If she's speaking to her family, she spoke in an Irish accent. And after a few months hanging around me, she spoke to me, she spoke in an Australian accent. To the point that you could hear the difference in the classroom if she was addressing me or addressing anybody else. I mean, it was only a slight difference, but it was enough of a difference you could tell. I still remember going home from a choir performance. We were both in the choir together. And she was talking to her dad as he drove us home. And she was basically trying to convince him that she didn't need to do her homework when she got home, because she had study hall the next day, so she needed some homework to do when she got to study hall. And so she's doing all of this in an Irish accent, but then she turns to me to go, "Isn't that right, Tanya?" Trying to get me on board to help her convince her dad she could just relax when she got home. But that, you know, 4 or 5 words, whatever it was in an Australian accent, and then she flipped right back to the Irish accent speaking to her dad. Yeah, and so, you know, now that's something I'm really familiar with. It's a very common thing, and every time it comes up in conversations, I think about Alison and my first experience of hearing code switching in action. Yeah, and then, you know, all the way through, I had lots of other friends who were cross-cultural kids. I've talked about the cross-cultural kid model and all the different ways you can have cross-cultural experiences, and so many of my good friends were immigrant kids, were multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multicultural in some way, who had ties to more than one culture, were in minority cultures, and were so gracious to me to show me part of their experience and their world. I think, I don't know what it is. I think there's something in me that always wanted to understand, wanted to see that different way of being. Wanted to understand where someone was coming from in a way that I think could have been tiring sometimes, and yet I had friends who were really gracious and who were willing to share with me, and yeah, just to share with me, to share part of their lives with me, part of their experiences with me, to be genuinely my friend. And I look back and I think I don't think it's what pushed me I don't think that having those friends pushed me into working with TCKs, but I think it shows that the people I gravitated towards, that I wanted to be friends with, often had these experiences and these cross-cultural kind of childhoods. And so maybe that's why I clicked with the TCKs later on, is that there's always been something in me. I don't know why. As I said, my family background is very monocultural, you know, very white, Western European background, Australian. And yet, I've ended up here in China, married to someone from a different culture, working with cross-cultural stuff. I mean, I don't really know how I ended up here, but I'm glad I did, and I'm glad that this work gives me regular reasons to think back on those childhood friends who meant so much to me at the time and who I remain grateful to for their influence on me, for showing me pieces of the world and of human experience I wouldn't have known otherwise. And I think that's one of the best things about my life here as an adult, is that same thing, getting to know people with different experiences to me. Sometimes that can be tiring when there's almost no relationships that are not cross-cultural. I know very few Australians and spend very little time with Australians, so everything is a bit cross-cultural, and yet I value that. I really value that, and I'm glad that that's my life. So yeah, that's some reflections on me and some childhood friends, and yeah, guess you now know a little bit more about my story. Thanks for listening to me ramble and tell stories, and I'll see you next time. Bye.